next episode of DotVVM Minutes. Today we will be playing with DotVVM extensibility, and I will show you how to handle various keyboard shortcuts like Enter or Escape in your DotVVM web applications. In order to make our web applications really user-friendly, we should respond at least to the Enter key in our forms. So I have a very simple form here, and when I enter my username, so this is my username, this is my password. Obviously it's the same, it's not a good security practice, but this is just a demo. And when I press enter, which I'm doing right now, we want the button to be clicked, and I have set a breakpoint so we can make sure that it really was clicked, because there is no code, so we wouldn't notice if without the breakpoint. Yeah, so how this works? Luckily, HTML has its ways how to do these simple keyboard interactions. So if I use the form element around my form, and these controls, they just translate to input type text and input type password. And this button has this property, it's called isSubmitButton. And if you set this on a button, it will render as input type submit, which is the thing I need, because in pure HTML, if you are in a text box inside a form, so when you press the return key, it will look for the first submit button and click on it. Yeah, so this is the only thing you need to do if you need to press enter and handle this key in simple forms. The problem is that this works only for the simple scenarios. I have another page in my project. It contains a grid view control, and the situation here is very similar, because when I click edit, then I have a text box here, so I can modify the name of the country. But also when I press enter, I need the first submit button to be clicked. But the submit button is it's a table row, so I would need to embed this entire row in a form element. Unfortunately, the table element cannot have the form inside. Yeah, and this is another cell, so if just this text box would be in the form, it wouldn't find the submit button in the form. Yeah. I would be able to put the entire table in a form, but in every row I have a submit button. Some of them are hidden, but still they are there, so it wouldn't work quite easily. So I need to be able to tell DotVVM on which level it should search for the submit buttons. And when I'm doing that, I can also make it respond to the escape key, because when I press escape, I need the changes to be reverted. Okay, so how to solve this issue? Here's my page. I have a grid view control from the DotVVM business pack, but if you use the standard grid view control, it's very similar, and actually you will be facing the same problems inside. So what I basically need is to be able to tell DotVVM that this part of the page should behave like HTML form. It's not a form, but it should work like it was a form. Basically, I want every table row to behave like HTML form. So when I'm inside and when I press enter, it will search for the correct button and press it. And also, if I press escape button, it should also find the correct button and click it. Yeah. So I need to simulate the behavior of the form element. And of course, I could write a piece of jQuery code which would find the table and handle the correct events, but it wouldn't be a generic solution, and I want to implement this mechanism in a generic way, so I will be able to use it also in the model dialogues or anywhere else I need to handle the enter and escape keys. If I inspect this row, you can see that I have created KnockoutJS binding handler, this attribute data bind comes from KnockoutJS library, and I've created a knockout binding handler .vvm form helpers default button container. And my buttons also contain some special attributes. This is the text box, and in this, as you can see, here is the attribute data.vvm form helpers default button. So the button marked by this element will be pressed when I press enter, and the button with this element, with this attribute, will be clicked when I press escape. Yeah? So I have defined my own binding handler, which will listen to the key down events, and when it detects the return key, the enter key, it will find a button inside this element. It will find a button with this attribute and click on it. And if it detects the escape key, it will also find the button with this attribute and press it. Yeah, so this is what I want to achieve. So this is the knockout binding handler. It's a KnockoutJS mechanism how to extend the options, the features of KnockoutJS, and .vvm uses KnockoutJS inside. So this is a perfectly viable way to do it. And you can define your own binding handlers and apply them on any HTML element using the data bind. So if I return here, you can see data bind equals name of the binding handler and its value. Because I don't need to pass any value in the handler, I'm just passing through, but it can be basically any value. I just wanted something which will evaluate to true in JavaScript because it's safer. Yeah, so this is just that's the definition of the binding handler, and every binding handler has two functions. The first is init, and this function is called every time KnockoutJS creates a new element with this binding handler. This is a table row, and I'm inside a grid view, so if a new row appears, it will be element with this binding handler, so the init method will be called on every row, no matter when I create it. If it's there from the beginning, it will be called immediately. When I add some rows dynamically, later when the page is already loaded, the init function will be called for that element. The first parameter of this function is the element. The second one is value accessor. This is a function which I can call, and it will give me the value of this binding handler. Right now I don't need it because it's always true. It's just something needs to be there, but the value is actually not really important. Yeah. So this function will be called for any element that will have this binding handler as soon as possible. And what I'm doing, I'm just using jQuery. So I will create a jQuery wrapper over my element and listen to the key up event. And I'm declaring an empty array just to store the results. And if the key is key code 13, which is the enter key, I will be looking for the elements, anything that has this attribute equal to true. Yeah, so this will find me all the buttons. It can be more of them, so it will find all of the buttons with this attribute inside my element. Not anywhere else, not in the entire page, but only in my element. If the key is escape, I'm doing the same thing, except the attribute name is different, so it's cancel button, and it also needs to, the value is true. So I will look for the buttons. Else, if the key code is anything else, I'm doing nothing, so buttons will be empty. And if I have found some button, at least one, because if I don't use the escape button, the array will be empty. So if I find something, then I need to do a couple of things. The first thing is I need to call the blur on current element, which will be the text box or anything else. because text boxes write their values to the view model on the blur event when they lose its focus. Yeah, so first I need to make sure that the new value from the text box, which currently has focus, will be written to the view model. That's why I call blur. And then I'm taking the first button and calling the click on it. So I will just click on it. And because I don't want this event to bubble up to the parents in my tree, I will call stop propagation. It's useful also when you, for example, have a model dialog and you would use the same feature inside this block. Yeah, so for example, I would have the table which would have this behavior, and inside of the table somewhere there will be model dialog which needs to have the same behavior, but but it's inside. Yeah, so these containers can be nested inside, and that's why I call stop propagation, because I've already handled the key, and in case that there is some other default button container around me, I don't want the event to propagate there, but only if I found a button and click on it. If I didn't, I will send the key to the parent element because I don't know what to do with that. There is also an update function on the binding handler, which is called whenever this expression changes. This is true, so it's a constant, it will never change. But if this was a property from the view model, it can change, and in that case, the update is called, so I can do anything when the value changes. So this is a piece of necessary JavaScript, and because I really don't remember the names of this binding handler and the names of the attributes for the buttons, I would like to create a wrapper over these things in .vvm. So I have declared a C# class, which is called form helpers, and it's a C# class which declares a thing which is called attached property. You can add attached property to any HTML element or to any .vvm control in the markup, and it can add some additional behavior to the control or to the element. In this case, I just need to render the data bind equals my knockout binding handler is true, so the event key up event will be listened and handled correctly. And also on the buttons, I need to mark the default button and the escape button. Yeah. So this property can be set on any control or any element. It will render the binding handler, and this property can be set and it will render the attribute which will be used to find the correct button to be clicked. Yeah. And here I'm using the delegate action property register on the class form helpers, and here is the name of the attached property, and the syntax will be form helpers dot default button container, because it's attached property. You always need to specify the name of the parent class. And delegate action property means that if this property is used on an element or a control, this function will be called when this control is being rendered. So I can add something to the HTML output. Yeah, so here, if you apply this property, I will call this method. Yeah, so basically, when I'm rendering the control or the element, I will just say writer at knockout data bind .vvm form helpers default button container, and the value is true. Yeah, so no matter what the control would produce, I will add another data bind expression. This is the binding handler name, and this is the value. And similarly, this is default button is cancel button. They are calling this method and this method. Yeah, so I'm adding attribute data.vvm form helpers default button and cancel button. Yeah, so these are my helpers, And what's great is that it supports IntelliSense. So when you are here and you have your button, so I already have the attached property specified here, but you have IntelliSense for that. So you don't need to remember anything. You just say form helpers is default button equals true, and the IntelliSense just works. The same applies for cancel button. And the last thing is I need to add the knockout binding handler to each table row element, the TR element. But in the grid view, I'm only specifying columns, not the rows. They are generated automatically. However, I have a thing which is called row decorators, and basically you can apply any attribute or any other thing on the rows which are being rendered. So I have specified edit row decorator, and I'm using .decorator, which is a built-in control that doesn't render anything. It can just add attributes or data binds to an element which is inside. And I'm just saying, okay, apply this decorator on every editable table row. And I'm saying use this attached property, so it will generate the knockout binding handler. Yeah. So this is the last piece of magic. It doesn't need to be used. You could also say data bind equals and use it directly, but you wouldn't have any IntelliSense. If I want to add a model dialog and use this in a model dialog, I can. The model dialog would have something like form helpers, default button container is true, which means that the escape and enter key handling happens here. There will be some header template, my dialog. There can be some content template, which will contain my form. Yeah, so here would be the form controls. And in the footer, I would place the save and cancel buttons, and I will use is default button and is cancel button. And because the entire dialog is the default button container, anywhere inside this model dialog, when I press enter, the first button will be clicked, and when I press escape, the second one will be clicked. Yeah. So this is a very generic solution to the problem of keyboard of key handling, and you can use it anywhere in any control in any scenario where the standard HTML features do not work. I forgot to mention one important thing. You need to get this JavaScript in the page somehow. And because I'm using KnockoutJS here and jQuery, I need to make sure that this script comes after KnockoutJS and jQuery. I'm in the .vvm startup. I'm registering a new resource called form helpers. It's a JavaScript. The path where to look for it is here, and I'm setting dependencies to Knockout and jQuery. Yeah, so .vvm will know that Knockout and jQuery must be rendered first before this form helpers resource is here. And also in the grid, I need to explicitly request this resource. That's a limitation of current version .vvm. Currently, the attached property cannot add any additional resources in the output. We will be addressing this in the future versions of .vvm. Right now, you need to request it manually. You can put this in the master page, so you don't need to take care of it individually. You can add it to all the pages in the applications, but of course this is not so efficient, so you may choose whether you want to do this in the master page or individually on any page which will use the form helpers. Yeah. Okay, I hope that you understood all of the JavaScript magic which happened here. If not, feel free to have ask us in the comments under this video or on our Gitter chat, gitter.im/riganti/.vm. Okay, see you next time. Bye.